Welcome to Testaments of Faith, Samuel, the prophet who changed Israel. From a mother's prayer to God's calling, Chapter 1. Hannah, the woman who cried for the impossible. Times were difficult in Israel. The people lived under the rule of judges, and spiritual corruption plagued the nation. At the temple in Shiloh, where the Ark of the Covenant rested, the priests indulged in greed and sin, straying further from God. But even in the darkness, God always has a plan, and he would begin his work through a despised woman and an impossible promise. Among the hills of Ephraim, there lived a man named Elkanah. He had 2 wives, Peninnah, who bore him children, and Hannah, who was barren. While Peninnah flaunted her fertility, Hannah carried the weight of humiliation. Year after year, as they traveled to Shiloh to offer sacrifices to the Lord, Peninnah cruelly provoked her, mocking her pain. Hannah tried to ignore it, but her soul was shattered. On one such occasion, while others feasted, Hannah withdrew to the altar, falling to her knees, tears streaming down her face. It was a silent cry, but God heard every word in her heart. Her body trembled as she whispered, "Lord of hosts, if you will look upon the affliction of your servant and give me a son, I will dedicate him to you for all his days." On the other side of the altar, the high priest Eli watched. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Mistaking her anguish for drunkenness, Eli rebuked her, "How long will you be drunk? Put away your wine." But Hannah lifted her tear-stained eyes and replied, "I have neither drunk wine nor strong drink. I am a woman in distress, pouring out my soul before the Lord." Eli, taken aback, stepped back and said, "Go in peace. May the God of Israel grant you what you have asked." Unknowingly, Eli had sealed a destiny that would change the course of Israel's history forever. Chapter 2. The Fulfilled Promise. When God answers the impossible. Days passed, and something began to change in Hannah. The sorrow in her eyes was slowly replaced with a quiet hope. Her heart beat with the faith that God had heard her cry. And then it happened. Hannah conceived a child, and when she held him in her arms for the first time, her heart overflowed with gratitude. She named him Samuel, "because I asked the Lord for him." Every tiny feature of his face was a reminder that God hears and answers. The child who once existed only in her tears was now alive, breathing, a testament to the power of the Almighty. The years passed quickly, and Samuel grew strong and healthy under his mother's watchful eyes. But Hannah had not forgotten her promise. When he was weaned, she took his small hand and journeyed to Shiloh, where it all began. The stone temple loomed large before her, and there stood Eli, the priest who unknowingly had prophesied her miracle. Hannah, with a steady voice and tears welling in her eyes, said, "O my Lord, I am the woman who stood here praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my request. Therefore, I give him to the Lord for all the days of his life." She then placed Samuel in Eli's care. Any mother's heart would have broken at leaving her son behind, but Hannah didn't see it as a loss. She saw it as an offering. Samuel did not belong to her but to the Lord. And on that day, within the temple walls, Hannah lifted her voice in a song of praise, declaring God's greatness. Her sorrow had turned to worship, and her son would become far more than just a child. Hannah had no idea that Samuel would grow to change the destiny of an entire nation. Chapter 3. Growing in the presence of God. The boy who would hear the Lord's voice. Young Samuel quickly adapted to his new life in the temple of Shiloh. While other children ran free across Israel's fields, he lived among the stone columns of the temple, learning the sacred rituals and serving the Lord from an early age. Eli, the high priest, taught him the law, and Samuel displayed a pure and obedient heart. But around him, sin corrupted the house of the Lord. Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, dishonored the priesthood with greed and immorality, taking offerings for themselves and despising God's holiness. Yet, Samuel remained untainted. He grew in favor, and the Lord was with him. One night, the temple lay in silence, And Samuel slept near the Ark of the Covenant, beside the lampstand that still burned. Suddenly, a gentle voice pierced the darkness. "Samuel, Samuel." The boy awoke, startled, and ran to Eli, saying, "Here I am, for you called me." But the old priest shook his head and replied, "I did not call you. Go back and lie down." Samuel obeyed, but soon the voice called again, "Samuel!" Again he ran to Eli, who once more sent him back to sleep. When the voice called a third time, Eli realized it was God speaking to the boy. With tired eyes but newfound understanding, he told Samuel, "If you are called again, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant hears.'" Samuel returned to his bed, his heart pounding. Then, for the fourth time, the voice echoed in the darkness, "Samuel, Samuel." This time he sat up and answered with reverence, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." At that moment, Samuel was chosen to be more than just a servant in the temple. He would become God's voice to Israel. Chapter 4. The first prophecy, when God reveals a nation's destiny. The temple remained shrouded in darkness, and Samuel stood still, feeling the weight of God's presence surrounding him. For the first time, the Lord had spoken directly to him, and the words he heard were not easy to bear. God revealed a judgment against Eli's household, the high priest. "Tell Eli that his house will be destroyed, for his sons have blasphemed against me, and he did not restrain them." Samuel's heart pounded. How could he, just a boy, deliver such a message to his mentor? As the sun rose, Samuel hesitated to share the vision with Eli. He walked through the temple as usual, but the burden of God's words weighed heavily upon him. Then Eli called him, "My son, what did the Lord say to you? Do not hide it from me." Taking a deep breath, Samuel told him everything, leaving nothing out. Upon hearing God's verdict, Eli lowered his head and said, "He is the Lord, let him do what seems good to him." A solemn silence filled the air. Eli's household was condemned, and young Samuel now bore the responsibility of being God's voice. From that day forward, Samuel grew in stature and wisdom, and none of his words fell to the ground. All of Israel knew that the Lord was with him, and the nation no longer saw him as just a temple servant but as a prophet of the Most High. The corrupt priesthood was nearing its end, and a new era was on the horizon. Israel did not yet realize that Samuel would not only bring messages from God, he would also lead the people through the most significant transition in their history, the Age of Kings. Chapter 5. The Lost Ark. The day Israel fell. Years passed, and Samuel became a widely respected prophet in Israel. Yet, despite hearing his words, the people continued to drift away from the Lord. Meanwhile, the Philistines, longtime enemies, gathered their armies for war against Israel. The Israelites, confident in their strength, marched into battle but suffered a crushing defeat. 4,000 men fell in the first encounter. In desperation, the elders of Israel devised a reckless plan. "Let us bring the Ark of the Covenant into the battle. Then the Lord will fight for us." The Ark was brought from Shiloh, carried by Eli's corrupt sons, Hophni and Phinehas. When it arrived at the camp, the Israelites roared with excitement, believing that the Ark's mere presence would secure victory. But God cannot be manipulated. The Philistines, hearing the thunderous cries, grew afraid. "God has come into the Hebrews' camp. We are doomed." But instead of fleeing, they steeled themselves, "Fight like men, lest we become slaves to the Hebrews." The battle resumed, and Israel's defeat was even worse. 30,000 soldiers fell, and the unthinkable happened. The Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines. Hophni and Phinehas were slain on the battlefield, and Israel fell into despair. When the news reached Eli, now old and blind, his heart could not bear it. Upon hearing that the ark was taken, he fell from his chair, broke his neck, and died. The high priest was gone, Israel was defeated, and the glory of the Lord seemed to have left the nation. Yet, even amid calamity, God was already preparing restoration through Samuel. Chapter 6. The Ark of the Covenant returns. When God displays his power. The Ark of the Covenant was now in the hands of the Philistines, taken as a war trophy to the city of Ashdod and placed inside the temple of Dagon, their pagan god. The Philistines believed they had defeated the God of Israel. But God cannot be conquered. The next morning, when they entered the temple, they found Dagon's statue fallen before the ark, as if bowing in worship. Shocked, the priests set it upright. But the next day, they witnessed something even more terrifying. Dagon had fallen again, this time with its head and hands severed. Fear gripped the Philistines. The presence of the God of Israel was undeniable, and they had dared to challenge it. Then, a plague struck the city. Tumors spread among the people, and panic filled the land. They realized that the ark was not a war trophy but a curse upon them. They sent it to Gath, but there the plague worsened. They tried to move it to Ekron, but the people refused to receive it. Fear swept through all of Philistia. "Send the ark back before we all perish," the Philistine rulers declared. To test whether their suffering was truly from the God of Israel, they placed the ark on a cart pulled by oxen, along with a gold offering, and let the animals roam freely. If the oxen headed toward Israel, it would confirm that the Lord had afflicted them. And that is exactly what happened. Without any guidance, the oxen went straight to Beth Shemesh, an Israelite town. The people of Israel rejoiced at the return of the ark. But the lesson was not over. When some men dared to open the ark, they were struck dead instantly. God was showing the world that his presence is holy and must never be treated carelessly. Chapter 7. Revival in Israel. When the people turned back to God. The Ark of the Covenant had returned to Israel, but the people had not yet learned to revere God's holiness. After the tragedy in Beth Shemesh, where many died for treating the ark carelessly, it was taken to the house of Abinadab in Kiriath Jearim. There it remained for 20 years, forgotten by most of Israel. But God was not finished with his people. As the nation drifted away, Samuel rose as an undisputed leader, a prophet who spoke directly with the Lord. Over the years, Israel's suffering grew. The Philistines continued to oppress them, and the people felt the weight of their disobedience. Then, Samuel stood up and called the nation to repentance. Before a gathered multitude, he declared, "If you return to the Lord with all your hearts and remove the foreign gods from among you, he will deliver you from the hands of the Philistines." A deep silence fell. Then, something extraordinary happened. The people acknowledged their sins and began destroying the idols of Baal and Ashtoreth, the pagan gods that had corrupted their faith. Revival had begun in Israel. Samuel summoned the people to Mizpah for fasting and prayer. There, the Israelites confessed, "We have sinned against the Lord." It was a moment of brokenness and renewal. But the Philistines heard about the gathering and marched to attack the unarmed people. When the Israelites saw the enemy army approaching, fear gripped them. They ran to Samuel, pleading, "Cry out to the Lord for us, that he may save us." The prophet raised his hands to heaven and offered a burnt sacrifice to the Lord. As the offering burned on the altar, something supernatural occurred. A deafening thunder roared from the heavens, throwing the Philistines into panic. Struck with fear, they fled in confusion, pursued and defeated by Israel's army. God had fought for his people. Chapter 8. The demand for a king. When Israel rejects God's rule. Years passed, and Samuel continued to judge Israel with justice and righteousness. The nation enjoyed peace and prosperity under his leadership, for the Lord himself was Israel's true king. But over time, the next generation began to look at the surrounding nations and desire what they had, a human king, a ruler they could see. The longing for something earthly started to erode Israel's faith. As Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons, Joel and Abijah, as judges in his place. But unlike their father, they did not walk in the ways of the Lord. They were greedy, accepting bribes and corrupting justice. The people, discontented, saw this as an opportunity to demand change. The elders gathered and came to Samuel, saying, "You are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now, appoint for us a king to judge us, like all the other nations." Samuel's heart was pierced like a sword. Israel wasn't just asking for a new leader, they were rejecting the leadership of God. Distressed, Samuel prayed to the Lord, and God answered, "Listen to the voice of the people, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from reigning over them." Yet, God instructed Samuel to warn them of the consequences. "The king will take your sons for his wars, your daughters for his service, your harvests and lands for his court. And in the day you cry out because of the king you have chosen, the Lord will not hear you." But the people insisted, "No, we want a king over us. We want to be like the other nations, to have a man rule over us and fight our battles." Samuel's heart sank. They were trading God's perfect rule for the weakness of man. Then Samuel stood before the people and declared, "So be it. The Lord will give you a king." Israel had made their choice, but they would soon learn that rejecting God would come at a far greater cost than they imagined. Chapter 9. The choosing of Saul, Israel's first king. Israel had asked for a king, and God was about to grant their request. In a distant city, a young man named Saul lived, unaware that his destiny was about to change forever. Tall and strong, he was the perfect image of a leader in human eyes. But his story would begin in an unusual way, by searching for lost donkeys. Saul's father, Kish, had lost his animals and sent his son with a servant to find them. They wandered for days without success, until they reached Ramah, where Samuel lived. Saul's servant suggested, "There is a man of God in this city. Everything he says comes true. Let's go to him." Reluctantly, Saul agreed. But he didn't know that God had already spoken to Samuel the night before. "Tomorrow I will send you a man from Benjamin. You shall anoint him as prince over Israel." When Saul stood before Samuel, the prophet looked at him intently and said, "You are the one the Lord has chosen as king of Israel." Saul was stunned. "Me? But I am from the smallest tribe, and my family is the least significant." Samuel smiled and took him to a banquet, serving him the best portion. The next day, he poured oil over Saul's head and declared, "The Lord has anointed you as king over his inheritance." As Saul departed, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he prophesied among men. The young man who had set out to find donkeys now bore the crown of a king. Days later, Samuel gathered all the people to announce God's chosen one. Before the crowd, he proclaimed, "The Lord has given you a king. Behold Saul, your king." But when they called for him, he was nowhere to be found. Saul had hidden among the baggage, fearful of his new role. The man chosen by God already showed signs of insecurity. But when he finally stepped forward, he was striking, taller than anyone, with the stature of a ruler. The people shouted, "Long live the king!" Israel finally had the leader they had longed for, but they had no idea that their choice would bring trials and sorrows that would only be revealed in due time. The story of Samuel and Saul teaches us that what we ask for is not always what is best for us. Israel wanted a king but rejected God's perfect rule. How often do we chase after things without seeking the Lord's will? Saul was anointed, but what truly matters is not the position we hold, but whether our hearts remain faithful to God. Like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more content. Stay with God, and see you next time on Testaments of Faith. Thank you.